Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Harris, and I'm the Director of the National High School Center at the American Institutes for Research. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Progress Monitoring with the Early Warning System Tools. Today's presentation is the fifth in a series of 5 webinars that focus on the Early Warning Intervention and Monitoring System implementation process and our Early Warning System tools. Today's webinar will be archived on our website, www.betterhighschools.org. If you were unable to join us for the previous presentations in this series, those recordings have already been archived on our website. I'm joined today by my colleagues Jenny Scala, Matt Howenstein, and Laura Urhart, who are members of the Center's Early Warning System team. Today's presentation has 2 parts. First, Jenny will provide a brief overview of the progress monitoring and how it aligns with the EWS tools. Following her 30-minute presentation, she, Matt, and Laura will take questions through our EWS Community of Practice online chat. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jenny.
Great. Thank you for that nice introduction. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As we just heard, we just had our welcome and introduction. I'm going to give an overview, as Joe said, of progress monitoring within early warning system tools, as well as some background information around progress monitoring in general. And then myself and 2 colleagues will be available on the online chat portion of the National High School Center's Community of Practice to answer any questions that you have. So this really, in terms of talking about progress monitoring, is step 6 of the Early Warning Intervention and Monitoring System step process. And in this step, what we're going to be doing and what the real purpose of this step is to monitor students who are participating in various interventions. And when we're monitoring students in this capacity, this allows us to identify students who are struggling and might need additional interventions or instructional supports, as well as identify those students who may no longer be struggling after receiving services or just for whatever reason no longer are struggling and therefore no longer need additional support. We're also able to use progress monitoring data to look at the effectiveness of interventions, and this then allows us to have general improved knowledge around effectiveness of the interventions, and I'll talk more about that in a few slides to come. And then it also helps us make sure that we have the best matched interventions to the students' needs. We talked a little bit about selecting interventions in the previous webinar as well, so if you have questions about that, that'd be a great place to start, and we can also answer some of those questions as well during our online chat as well. Also, during step 6 of this process, we want to make sure that you continue to communicate with the appropriate stakeholders. This is stakeholders within the school as well as including family members, including students as well. We want to make sure that we are getting their involvement in the process as well as when we talk about schools and if there are feeder schools and patterns that we can get information about students from various grade levels as well. So this next set of slides is really what I would consider more of some background and some foundational pieces around progress monitoring so that we understand really truly kind of the purpose of progress monitoring. And so when we have our data that comes from different progress monitoring probes, this then allows us and it tells us if students are meeting short and long-term goals that have been established for the students. So we want to make sure that we have some short-term goals, so more immediate goals, as well as long-term performance goals, which might be end-of-year benchmark, something of that idea. But we need both short and long-term performance goals. Progress monitoring data also tells us if students are making progress at an acceptable rate. So hopefully students are improving, that they're making progress, but we want to make sure that they're making progress at a steep enough rate so that if there is some sort of a gap that we're trying to close, that we can close that gap before that long-term goal is met. And progress monitoring data can also tell us if instruction needs to be adjusted or changed. Now, what it doesn't tell us is specifically what needs to be adjusted. It's just a way of getting an indication that something needs to be adjusted. Another way to think about progress monitoring and the information we can get from progress monitoring is that when we have information from progress monitoring, it allows us to come up with or create and estimate a student's rate of improvement. So we can end up getting and creating what we would call a trend line in terms of getting ideas about how a student is likely going to continue to improve based on how they've been, their responses to different progress monitoring probes up to that point in time. Again, progress monitoring also allows us to identify students who are not demonstrating adequate progress so that we can know who those students are, and then we can make sure that we can figure out what we need to do, but we first need to make sure that we've identified who those students are who are not making sufficient progress. Another way that we can use progress monitoring data is if you have various forms or multiple types of instruction or intervention supports that have the same target purpose, they're achieving the same objectives in terms of academic or behavior supports. If you're using multiple forms of interventions within the school, looking at the data of how students are doing or progress monitoring data can allow you then to compare the efficacy of various instructional programs that you have in the school. This can be helpful in schools or in districts where there are multiple instruction or intervention programs that are occurring, and you want to decide to focus your resources on selecting or just providing some of them rather than providing a large list of them. Some schools have used progress monitoring data to winnow out what they want to then provide in terms of various instruction and intervention programs. It's important, though, with this last note on this slide, though, that you want to make sure that if you are comparing different forms of interventions and programs, that they are comparable in terms of the content that's being covered. So in other words, you want to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples rather than apples to onions. So make sure that they are covering the same content if you're going to use your progress monitoring data in that capacity. So some things to keep in mind as we're looking at the effectiveness of our information that we get. So within progress monitoring, we first need to make sure that the intervention is being delivered with fidelity before we can really look at some of the progress monitoring data. Because if that intervention or that support isn't delivered as it was intended, then the results or even the progress monitoring probe, if those weren't delivered as intended, then we are less confident in the results that we're getting with those either progress monitoring probes or the entire intervention. So we want to make sure that we are providing those intervention or those instructional supports, that those are being delivered as they were originally designed, or often called fidelity. You can also look at evaluating the general program or the intervention effectiveness. So and when you're looking at that really at the student level, you'll see that these last three bullets on this slide talk about that. So specifically for progress monitoring, the most common way that we are determining effectiveness for individual students is by graphing students' progress monitoring results. So getting that data, graphing it, drawing trend lines, and there's lots of information that exists about how to do that. Oftentimes, if you're using a computer-based program, it will do that automatically for you as you input students' performance data. You want to review that data every 4 to 6 weeks. And really a way to think about that is you want to make sure that you're reviewing your data so that you can make appropriate decisions and adjustments if those need to be made. So rather than just collecting that data, we want to make sure that we have built in the time to review the data. And it's recommended that occur every 4 to 6 weeks. And then again, when you're making decisions about what happens in terms of that database decision-making conversation based on what the progress monitoring data is telling you, you want to make sure that you're using evidence-based decision-making criteria. And we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of our slides here today. So when we think about progress monitoring, there's generally two types of progress monitoring measures. One is called the mastery measurement, and the second one is called general outcome measures. And I'm going to go through each of these separately to provide some information and some context about each type of progress monitoring measure. And then I'm going to talk about some considerations in terms of how this really links into the early warning system work. A general aside, though, that I'll start out with is that progress monitoring measures, there are aspects that I'll highlight of how the early warning system tool can be used to help get some information for progress monitoring. But generally, you're going to need additional data around progress monitoring that's not necessarily captured within the tool for conducting progress monitoring and making some of those decisions. And if you have more questions about that, as I would guess many people might, please stay on and participate in our online chat, and we can talk more about that as well. So mastery measurement. What is mastery measurement? Well, the name is fairly clear in terms of what it is. And so a mastery measure is when there's been a series of short-term instructional objectives, and a student needs to demonstrate mastery of that discrete skill as a way of showing that they've learned it before the information or the curriculum or the program, the intervention or instruction moves on to the next task or content that will be mastered. So there are two aspects that are really key to mastery measurements. And the first one you'll see in the yellow tab, the yellow bullet, is that there is a sequence for the school year in terms of what's going to be conducted. And it's some sort of sensible sequence. If you think more at the elementary level, you would say, well, we're going to teach people how to add whole numbers, teach students how to then subtract whole numbers. Then we're going to add on complexity, and that complexity could be, adding double digits, adding with regrouping, subtracting, I guess it's carryover, and then regrouping. So there's different ways that you can make it more complicated, but there is some sort of a sequence that's been established for throughout the school year for students. And then what happens is that there are these testing procedures that match each step in the instructional sequence. So we'll have students do a specific targeted task, and we'll give them some assessments and some progress monitoring probes on that discrete skill before we move on and teach them something. And that's mastery measurement. Some of the benefits of mastery measurement is that there is this sensible instructional sequence. However, generally also what happens with mastery measurement is once you've taught that discrete skill, you move on to another skill. You don't necessarily cycle back. And so this is really discrete, so you have to have this sensible time frame figured out. And with some of the work that we're doing in high schools, it can be really challenging to say, here's the sensible instructional sequence for the school year around this high school curriculum. So keep that in mind if you're thinking about mastery measurement. We often at the high school level see mastery measures in progress monitoring being used for students that are receiving that more intense and customized and individualized supports. That might be something that can help them really build up areas where students might have some instructional deficits. General outcome measures is the other progress monitoring type of measure. This reflects competency in the overall curriculum, which means that we're going to be able to have growth over time. And so we can then get what we would call students' current status, and then how they're doing if we're going to give them the progress monitoring probe maybe a few weeks out. We'll be able to see how those are comparable points, because the content that's being covered is throughout the curricula. Whereas what we just had with the mastery measure, you're only going to be talking about discrete skills. You're not able to compare growth over the annual curriculum. General outcome measures also provide decision-making models for designing and evaluating interventions. So as you are thinking about selecting interventions, as you're implementing interventions, it's helpful to know the difference between mastery measurement and general outcome measures specifically related to progress monitoring. This general outcome measurement does give you that growth over time. Most people are using general outcome measures as progress monitoring probes or specific types of general outcome measures. And the early warning system tool gives us some information that would be more aligned with the general outcome measure type of information than the mastery measurement type of progress monitoring probe. So some considerations within the early warning system tool as we specifically think about progress monitoring. Well, the early warning system tool that the National High School Center has created, and we've provided many webinars on the background around it, gives us an attendance count. You can select it's either a 20 or 30-day time period, so you can get some data at that point that you can use, similar to progress monitoring. It would be considered a time sampling. So how did students do within this 20 or 30-day time period? You're also able to look at your data through different grading periods, and so you can compare your data that way. It might not necessarily be a if it's within the semester and it's 2 quarters, that could be considered a growth over time for a general outcome measure. But if you're comparing semester 1 and semester 2, and those are different classes, that's something to be aware of, as well as that might not necessarily allow you to compare across the entire year. And the early warning system tool is less sensitive to growth than traditional progress monitoring measures. And most of that is because you're putting in your data at the grading periods besides the attendance count. And so that's not necessarily frequently enough to be able to show students growth in a progress monitoring lens. Whereas traditional progress monitoring measures are more sensitive to growth. So even if you're using a general outcome measure, which gives you that growth over time, you'll be able to see how students are doing much more frequently than you would if you're only using the early warning system tool. And traditional progress monitoring measures really end up having specific probes, if you will. And those probes can vary in terms of their time frame of when they're delivered. So for the students that are receiving that Tier 3 or that customized, individualized support, those students are probably receiving progress monitoring probes on a weekly basis. And students that are receiving targeted or Tier 2 supports might be getting those progress monitoring probes every other week or every 2 weeks. It depends on what supports and how those supports are really designed. A few things to point out here, because this is really the meat of a lot of our information, is don't think of, we would encourage you to think of this not as an either-or, but that the early warning system tool data provides some great information. You also are going to probably get some additional progress monitoring measures and data from that can help you get a more holistic picture of how students are doing. It should not be considered an either-or. It's a way that both of these can help get information, more holistic information about students. Oftentimes in the high school setting, we get a lot of questions about what people are doing around progress monitoring. And again, the National High School Center cannot make any recommendations or endorsements for any specific types of progress monitoring probes, but we do know that this is an area where there's a challenge for many high schools in terms of figuring out how to progress monitor students sufficiently so that there's enough data to be able to make decisions about how students are doing in a way that is useful in terms of making those decisions. And again, I would encourage you to come over to the chat for more information, and perhaps there you all can also share what you've worked, what you're experiencing, and some challenges around those different types of progress monitoring probes. So in general, when you're thinking and when you're implementing progress monitoring, you want to make sure that you're reviewing that data at predetermined intervals, but that you're also giving those progress monitoring probes on a regular basis. So if you are working in a intensive Tier 3 support, if you are going to be doing it weekly in terms of progress monitoring probes, and continuing that throughout the rest of the grading period and the quarter or semester, and making sure that that's predetermined what those intervals are in terms of when progress monitoring is going to occur, especially if you've got multiple classes that are giving additional support so that you have consistent amount of progress monitoring data points across classes to help make decisions. Having a schedule prior to the beginning of instruction of when progress monitoring will occur. It doesn't necessarily have to be as minute as the exact time within a day, but so that there are ballpark time frames so that everyone knows what those time periods are going to be, so that you can also schedule those meetings of, okay, so our progress monitoring data, we've got it. Let's now be able to look at how students are doing. We've gotten progress monitoring data for 6 data points. Let's really see how students are doing with these interventions and being able to have sufficient data points to make some of those decisions. You want to make sure that you're involving relevant team members. And specifically at the high school level, I would include students in terms of having students graph or monitor their own progress monitoring data, have them be involved as well in setting and establishing their long and short-term goals as well. They can definitely be involved in that process and get them more bought in and some additional ownership in the task at hand. So involving the relevant team members and as well as students. One of the things, and we talked about this early on in our webinars around meetings and making sure that there's a standard agenda and that minutes are taken and disseminated appropriately. And all of that is also true for when you're having meetings specifically about progress monitoring data. And you also want to make sure that you have some determination of, if you're going to be talking about individual students as well as groups of students, so that you can start to see how groups of students are doing. If all of your students that are receiving a specific intervention and the progress monitoring data is showing that intervention is not getting great results for the students, but if we only looked at student by student, we might not see this overarching group trend. So you do want to make sure that you're looking at group trends as well. Some additional procedures to take note of when you're discussing your data. Having these routines and procedures in writing is important, and specifically around, when are we making decisions about when students have enough data so that we can determine if a change needs to happen? Is it 4 to 6 data points? Is it 8? So getting some decisions and having those decisions disseminated out to the staff so staff understand how these probes and the data that's collected from these probes are getting used in other contexts. So making sure people understand that as well. You want to make sure that those routines are established, that procedures are also getting followed, specifically around progress monitoring probes. So if the progress monitoring probes require a student to be on a computer for 20 minutes every 6 times that they're working on this curriculum, we want to make sure that's occurring and that students are doing those 20-minute probes rather than skipping those and just moving on. So making sure that those procedures are getting followed, making sure that you've figured out how you're going to check for those procedures that they're getting followed as well. So we talked last time about fidelity around implementing the instructional support or the programs, but there's also some importance to be addressed around fidelity for progress monitoring as well. And this last point on this slide also gets at kind of making sure that we want to make sure that the routines and procedures are also culturally and linguistically responsive and appropriate. We also want to limit the time that we spend admiring data. So often can be as we have those data days in schools that we all get really excited to look at the data, and we might end up doing a little tangential bird walk looking at kind of overall how the data is and different ways of looking at the data rather than getting really clear about making sure that we get to those purposes that we decided we needed, that we determined what we need to discuss. So oftentimes we call that admiring the data. So we want to limit that time of just admiring the data and get to some of these overarching aspects as well. And then you also want to, as you start to look at this data and have these conversations, look at the different interventions and accommodation options that the staff do have at their disposal. That might be a factor in terms of looking at different data points as well. So that was a very, very brief overview of progress monitoring and progress monitoring as it relates to the early warning system tool and the overall early warning intervention and monitoring systems process. All of this information will be on our website. As we started off explaining that all of the archived webinars are already available at this first URL that's on your screen. We've also established an online community of practice where we hope you're going to join us in just a few minutes, where we will take some time to answer any additional questions that you might have. We also have additional early warning system products tools at that third URL on the screen. Information includes our tools for the high school and middle grades. We also have an implementation guide. We have additional research and reports that are also posted. If you're unable to participate in our online chat that'll take place in just a few minutes, you can also send us any questions at ews@betterhighschools.org with any questions. Additional information about the National High School Center can be found at our website, which is www.betterhighschools.org. You can also follow us on Twitter, become a Facebook fan. We do have a YouTube channel as well. We have a great blog with lots of different blog postings, some that are also related to early warning systems work. And then our online community of practice, which is at http://community.betterhighschools.org. And that's actually where we're going to go for our question and answer session, which is next. So you can access the Early Warning System live chat by, first of all, entering our Early Warning System community, which is that link right below that first bullet. You do need to be logged in with your community username and password. Once you do that, on the main page for the Early Warning System group, there is a nice box that says Join Our Chat, or here's a URL for that. The My Chat Role application will be in the center of the page. We recommend that you hit the arrow button so that the chat role pops out into a different screen. It becomes a little bit larger. It's easier to follow it that way. And if you have any questions for accessing, my colleague Laura will remain on the line and answer any questions to help you get onto the page. Otherwise, we hope that you join us over at our online community of practice.